So far this morning, I think what I'm going to talk about is pretty much in line with what we've been talking about this morning. But it came from Simon. So Simon leads the worship team, and he wanted us to look at what it was to have a heart of worship, what that meant for us as a worship team. So that's sort of our theme going into the year. And how do we make sure that God is in our worship, and how do we make sure we're keeping ourselves right with God? And to answer that question, you need to start by understanding what is worship. When we say worship, I'm a worshipper of God, what do we mean by that? Because we do often talk about worship as in the songs we sing, the worship songs at the beginning of the service. And they're beautiful and very important. It's a very special time. But it's really more an expression of worship. So I wanted to have a look at what the Bible says is worship. And the Bible's a lot more expansive about a concept of worship than the one or two words that we might have for it. In the New Testament alone, there's at least 7 words that we kind of translate as praise and worship. Now I'm going to do something slightly unusual here. So usually I would sort of say, go and investigate something yourself, go and have a look, see what it says. But I'm going to warn you that if you go and do a word study on the words in the Bible that get translated as worship, that is one deep rabbit hole. You could be there for some time. You'll probably enjoy diving down that rabbit hole, but you could be there for some time. So for just this one occasion, can I ask that you just go with me for a little bit, and we're just going to do a super high-level skim. And caveats, my Greek is going to be wrong, undoubtedly. And there are probably some translation things that are going to be problematic. And I'm just going to ask you if we could just ignore those. and I'm hoping that God, in all his goodness, is going to get a message through regardless of my inability to translate Greek. Yeah, exactly. Holy Spirit, God. So I'm only going to pick out 4 words from the New Testament that get translated as sort of praise and worship, just to give us a sense of the sorts of things that the Bible talks about. So Rowan, can you put up the first slide? And the reason I've got it on a slide is because my pronunciation really will be so bad that I kind of figure at least having it in print gives you some kind of sense that you can ignore me. So sebo, means to personally esteem or worship. So it's sort of someone who's devout. And this can be a good thing, but it can be a bad thing. So Jesus uses this word in Mark 7:7, and he says, "In vain do they worship me." So he's saying they've got these acts of sebomai, these acts of worship. That's the word that's used there. But they're missing the heart. And that's the risk that as a worship team we want to avoid, that we could be praising, coming to church, doing the things, but they're acts of worship. If God's in the heart of that, that's beautiful, that's powerful, that's meaningful. But it's possible to do them without God being in the heart of it. And if you see someone doing those things, what you're seeing is acts of worship. You don't always see the heart behind that. So this one's a bit of a double-edged sword. It's not good or bad, they're just acts. But we have to think about what's actually happening behind those acts. So the next one, if we go to the next slide, Rowan. Euspio. Anyway, there's a term in Greek that we translate to worship, and what it means is reverence. So it's showing respect. It can be used in connection with God, but it can be used in connection for your parents. You show respect to your parents, to authority figures. And it's used, one of the places where it's used is Acts 17:23. And Paul is saying to the people of Athens, "For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you." So Paul was saying this worship that you do to these idols, this respect that you show, is to someone that you don't know. So you can have this kind of reverence worship to people you don't know. So we might say we show reverence towards a prime minister or a policeman or, the headmaster, all sorts of people that we might show reverence to. But we might not necessarily know them. There might not be a relationship there. He's saying, I can reveal the person that relation, you should be pointing that towards, where there is a relationship. So again, that one, if that's in connection with God, because you're experiencing a relationship and therefore you want to show reverence, that's obviously a good thing. So again, it's another word, but it doesn't show the meaning behind it. It's more about the way in which you're behaving. So next slide, please, Rowan. So our third word, I said there's lots of these, so it is a very deep rabbit hole, but we're only going to do 4 of them. Latreia latrou means to serve in a sacrificial manner. So we see this one, it's in Luke 2:37, and there's a widow, never leaves the temple, but worships day and night, and she's fasting and praying. So it's fasting and praying are acts of worship. Serving as a pastor is an act of worship. It's sacrificial. Any ministry we do, going out at the soup kitchen, that's a latreo act of worship. It's a sacrificial act of worship. So we're not talking loud, brash. It's kind of the doing the do. It's the being the hands and feet of God. And so that's, a beautiful way of demonstrating the sort of worship, the heart behind it, because you've got these sacrificial acts of worship. And now my favourite one. Next slide, please, Rowan. And this is also Jesus's favourite as well. Maybe a correlation there. Proskuneo, which means to move towards, as if to kiss. And this is the most prominent word used in the New Testament for worship. So it can mean sort of to kiss the master's hand, to bow down, to prostrate oneself. I have to be so careful with that word, to prostrate oneself, and to adore. So this one's about the heart of worship. It's more about the direction of your worship than the act itself. It's about what's the attitude that's sitting behind, what's in the heart that's causing the acts to come forward. And there's a story in the Bible that I think is just a beautiful demonstration of the way we can think of worship, and then the way what Jesus has in mind for worship and how much more beautiful that is. So going to go to John chapter 4. If you have your Bibles, you can follow along. I'm going to step through it. And this is the story of the Samaritan woman. So the first verse, so if we can go to our first verse, Rowan, we've got John, and we're going to do 1 to 4. We'll start there. So now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria. So before we get any further, I want to stop there. If we can go to our last slide, Rowan. Oh, poor Rowan. He's very capable. He's incredibly capable. So it says he had to go through Samaria. Now, for years I read that and went, oh, there must have been no other way. He had to go through Samaria. But actually, to go from Judea to where was he going? Galilee, yeah. I thought I got that wrong for a minute. To go from Judea to Galilee, the most common route was actually to go up via the Jordan. And that's because the Jews hated the Samaritans. They hated the Samaritans. They would rather go around than sully themselves by going anywhere near Samaria. So when Jesus says he had to go through Samaria, that is not a geographical statement of fact. It wasn't the geography that was driving him to have to go through Samaria, because most Jews would not have. They just went around. So if we put that to one side and we go, well, it's not a geographical thing, why did Jesus have to go through Samaria? He had a divine appointment, exactly. And I think what that comes from is Jesus, as we know, had 3 short years of ministry on earth. And he knew that the Jews were to reach all the world. Now, for Jesus, that included the Samaritans. But I think he knew that if he left that job to his fellow Jews, even his disciples, the Samaritans would have probably been last on the list. They would have gone, we're going to reach all the world, but maybe not the Samaritans. So I think Jesus knew if he was going to reach the Samaritans, he was going to have to lead the way. He was going to show them how that was done. So I think the had to go through Samaria was Jesus had to lead the way to reach even the Samaritans, because he knew the hearts of even the disciples would have struggled to do that. Now, the Bible doesn't say that, so I am coming up with a bit of conjecture there. But I think it invites us to stop and say, why? Why is Jesus going through this way? Because it's certainly not geographical. So anyway, Jesus went. So let's see what happens. We're going to go to John 4, 5 and 6. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. So interesting, just a little note here, that the Samaritans venerated Jacob. They believed that they came from the line of Jacob, and they worshipped God, just like the Jews worshipped God. The problem is they also worshipped other gods. They didn't solely worship God. God was not enough. They didn't want to trust fully in God. But they sort of said, we worship God just like the Jews worship God. He's our God too. But they wouldn't trust in God alone. Just an interesting context as we go through the story. So we're going to carry on now. John 4, go 7 to 10. And this is really getting into the story now. So when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You're a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." So now we're getting into it. So the first thing to note, it's noon, and the woman's going to the well. So that's clearly a sign that she doesn't want to be with the other women of the town, because most of the women of the town would have gone out to the well in the cool of the morning. But I really want us to note the Bible doesn't tell us why. For a long time, and it's still around a lot, I have heard stories that it's because she was a promiscuous woman, she was a woman of bad reputation, had possibly been caught up in adultery. But I now don't think that could be further from the truth. But I want to come back to that. As we go through the story and we get more evidence about what the Bible is telling us about this woman, we'll come back to that. But I just want to pause here, because if you have heard this story before and the image you have of this woman is a woman that's been caught up in adultery or a woman that's got a bad reputation, I'd ask you just to put that aside for a moment. Let's suspend judgment. And I promise we will come back to it, but I want us to have a look at what the Bible actually tells us about this woman. So the first thing that we saw in that passage, what does the woman say to Jesus? Yep, but the first thing she says is, "You are a Jew." No, I think this will... All right. Here we go. So she sees physically in front of her a man, and he's got some characteristics. So she knows some things about him. She knows the God he worships, for example, because she can recognize that Jesus is a Jew. And what does Jesus say? So I do think Jesus is here for a divine appointment, because he doesn't hang around. He dives straight into the conversation. He has a mission in mind with this woman. And so he goes straight to, if you knew God, I know you're worshipping God, but if you knew God, then you would know who I am. You'd recognize me. There'd be relationship there. And the Samaritan woman would have believed that she knew God. She went to the temple. She would have worshipped God. But she didn't know God. So Jesus is comparing her worship to that sort of first Sebamai type of worship. It's the acts of worship. She would have been doing the stuff, going to the temple, worshipping God. But she didn't really know God. And that can be like our acts of worship. We can come along to church, we can read the Bible. But if God isn't in those moments, then it's empty worship. The heart has to be right in those moments for it to actually mean anything. So if we find out what happens next, Jesus has sort of said, no, you don't really know God. You haven't got a relationship. There's something more. So how does the woman react to that? She says, "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it, as did also his sons and his livestock?" So just in that little interaction, she's gone from, "You're a Jew," to, "Sir." She's seen something in him. She's nodding her head and giving him a bit of that respect. She's seen something. So that's a bit of that euspeo sort of worship, that respect. So it's not a relationship. It's nothing more than that, but it's I see that you're worthy of a bit of respect. And what she's basically saying to Jesus in that passage is, no, I know God. She's saying to him, I have worshipped God. I am one of Jacob's children. God made a promise to Jacob that he would have a mighty nation. And this well, where we stand, this is Jacob's well, and this is the water that's fed Jacob and all the generations and all the livestock. So she's saying, I've experienced the promise of God because this is it. This is the provision of God. Jacob came, all the generations have been sustained by this well, by the provision of God. And you haven't even got a bucket. So I think she's standing there going, no. I have experienced God. I know who God is. And you haven't even got a bucket. So how can your water be greater than this well of Jacob's and the provision through generations that has provided? And what does Jesus say? How does he respond? So we go 13 to 15. Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And the woman said, Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water. And what's lovely here is Jesus is really reaffirming her. He's saying, I understand. You've been told that you're from the lineage of Jacob. You've been told you've been worshipping God. I understand, but trust me. Trust me. I have something that is more than this water. But you can see the woman's still not getting it. She's kind of going, that's great, give me that water and then I won't have to come back to this well anymore. So she's still not quite there. But Jesus is coming and meeting her where she's at. He's very gracious. And as the story goes on, so if we go 16 to 19, he told her, go, call your husband and come back. I have no husband, she replied. And Jesus said to her, you are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is that you have 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true. Sir, the woman said, I can see that you are a prophet. So Jesus has revealed to her that he really knows her. He's got something deeper. Not just I see you and I can see something about you, but he's shown some sort of relationship. And she recognizes in him that he is a prophet. He's someone who has lived in that latreia worship. He's had sacrificial worship in his life. And she can see that anointing on him as she moves forward and they carry on with this interaction. And she knows that. She can see that because of what Jesus has revealed to her. And that's that she's had 5 husbands and the man she is living with now is not her husband. So, what sort of a woman was she? In those times, if a Samaritan man entered into a marriage and was giving a marriage certificate, which wasn't always the way, it wasn't always that formal, it was often sort of conversational and arrangements that happened via conversation. But if there was a certificate of marriage, then the wife had some rights, or at least potential rights, over property. So marriage wasn't entered into lightly. And when they look at what is documented about marriage, to be married 5 times was extraordinary It did not happen. People didn't go from marriage to marriage, so that this woman had been in a situation where she'd been offered 5 marriages was an extraordinary situation. And it makes it highly unlikely that she was promiscuous or had been caught in adultery, because if she had, there is just no way a man would have given her a certificate of marriage. If she had been promiscuous, they wouldn't have had to give her a certificate of marriage. And if she'd been caught in adultery, there's no way, 2 or 3 times, there's just no way she would have got to 5 certificates of marriage if adultery had been in her past. So there's really only 2 possibilities based on what we know of the culture at the time. And one is that her husbands had died. And that's possible. Possibly possible for, 1 or 2, maybe that was the case. Really unlucky if she's had 5 husbands pass away. So, the chances of that are getting slimmer. But maybe there was 1 or 2. The other more likely scenario is that she was barren. She was unable to give her husband's children. And it was on that grounds that she was divorced. And if that's the case, then it's most likely that she was extremely beautiful. And it's also most likely that she was of extremely high character. That 5 men, despite the fact that she hadn't produced children for previous husbands, were willing to enter into a marriage with her. She was most likely very beautiful and of excellent character and reputation, because otherwise they would not have taken the risk. And when we talk about her current husband, there's a couple of scenarios, and the Bible doesn't say a lot about her current not husband. But there's a couple of possibilities. Possibly she's been taken on as a second wife. So we know, if your husband died, often the brother would take you on as a second wife. So it could be a comment when to say she's not married, could be a comment that something like that has happened to her and he's not done her the justice of marrying her because she's been married so many times before. Or it could be Jesus sort of acknowledging, the sacred nature of a first marriage. So acknowledging that the husband might have other wives and she's really a third wheel in this relationship. So it could be a comment that Jesus is making about the nature of that relationship. And we will probably never know exactly what that scenario is until we get to heaven. But there's a couple of things I want to point out, and we'll see more evidence that supports this later on. But later in the story, the woman goes and tells her story to the village, and they all believe her. There's no questioning. There's don't think she'd be telling the truth. They just get up and they go out and they meet Jesus, which points to the fact that she had an excellent reputation. She was trustworthy. She comes and says, I've met the Messiah, and they go, great, excellent, introduce us. It's that simple. So there's a lot of evidence to say she's got an excellent reputation. But the killer point for me is she is one of the few people in the Bible that Jesus doesn't tell to go and sin no more. And if you read all the stories in the New Testament of women or men who had sexual misconduct or any misconduct in their past, Jesus is not typically slow to say, go and sin no more. At no point does he admonish this woman. At no point does he say, that's a situation that you need to go and correct and even move out of. Jesus isn't entering into this conversation to rebuke or correct this woman. He's entering in to restore her. I think he's acknowledging that the world has done her wrong, not her by the world. So with that in mind, let's see how the story carries on. So we're going to read John 4, 20 to 26. So the woman has just acknowledged that Jesus is a prophet. And she says, "Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and now has come, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshippers must worship in spirit and in truth." And the woman said, "I know that Messiah called Christ is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." And then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, I am he." So now we have the woman really trying to understand. She's grappling with this question. And she's saying, she thinks the debate is about where we're going to worship. So as a bit of an aside, but an interesting aside, I think, the Samaritans had actually offered the Jews money to build the temple in Jerusalem. And the Jews had basically said, "No, we don't want your dirty money." And so there really is not a lot of love between these two groups. But the Bible writes that up as a good thing, because the Jews were meant to trust God for the money to build the temple. But of course the Samaritans went, "Well, if we can't give you money to build your temple to God, we will build our own temple to God." And so they set up this kind of rival. Where is it that we should worship God? And so she thinks that's the question they're getting to. Okay, if Jacob's well isn't where I'm supposed to get water, where am I supposed to go? Where is this living water? Which is the right temple? And of course, Jesus says, no. It is not about where you go to worship. It's about who you worship. It's about the heart behind your worship. And he uses that word proskuneo. It's about who you're leaning in towards. Where is the direction of your travel? It's not about where devout practices are carried out. It's not about who's the priest. It's not about the nature of the worship at the beginning of the service. It's not about any of that. It's about who have you come to worship. And he also says it's about honestly and earnestly seeking with your heart. So he's saying God is spirit, and it's your spirit. It's where is your spirit pursuing? Who is your spirit pursuing? Who's drawing you closer and trying to capture your heart so that you would want to lean forward and kiss the hand? And when it's spirit, you can't fake that. That's, God is spirit, and when it's in your spirit, that's your honest truth, isn't it? That's real to you when it's in your spirit. And Jesus says to her, "This man that's in front of you, that's me. I can show you that kind of love, that kind of salvation. I am that Saviour who's coming from the Jews, and I'm right here standing in front of you." I'm going to skip one verse. I know. I've got a bad habit of not skipping verses because I just like them all. But we're going to skip one. We're going to go to John 4, 28 to 29. "Then, leaving her water jar, the woman went back to town and said to the people, 'Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?' And so they came out of the town. And so now for her, the penny has dropped. Now she knows who it is that's been drawing her in. Now she's at that moment of proskuneo worship. I want to show you I want to help you picture the story, the journey that this woman has been on in this short conversation. And so I'm going to get some help from the crowd. So Jeff, would you... one I prepared earlier. Right. So if you can stand there. Yep. yeah. Just yep. Stand. Yep, like that. So here's Jesus. So sorry, here's Jesus. So I'm the woman. I see Jesus, and I'm seeing some things about him. So he's wearing Christian T-shirts. So he's a Christian. I got that. Don't ask me to explain the T-shirt. I have to look it up every time. Anyway. But I can see some things about him. And then we start a conversation. And it's, sir. You're like, yeah. I can see that you are worthy of some respect. And the conversation carries on and Jesus is drawing her in. And she's prophet. I can see that he is a man that has served God. I can see that he is a man that has lived sacrificially. And then by the end of the conversation, she's Messiah. And that's where Jesus wants us to be, proskuneo, at his feet, leaning in to kiss his hand. Thank you. Right. So because Jesus chose that word proskuneo, and it means to lean in as if to kiss the hand, I want to kind of rephrase one of the verses. So it's John 4:24. So I'll read it as it is in my Bible first, and then I'll do a little Kate translation. So it's, God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in the spirit and in the truth. So I can imagine this woman heard something a bit like this. God is spirit, and the people that lean towards him with a kiss lean towards him in their spirit, and it's their honest truth that they love him. That's kind of the translation of that verse when you think of that proskuneo, leaning in as if to kiss. And I just think that's beautiful. You know, this woman must have been heartbroken. Man has not treated her well. She's been looking for love in all the wrong places and been cast aside through, most likely, no fault of her own. And here is Jesus saying, lean towards me. I can provide a love that satisfies. I'm a love everlasting that won't leave you wanting for love. As we finish up today, I just want to make a couple of points. This unnamed woman, we never even know her name. She becomes the first missionary in the Bible. She's the vehicle Jesus chooses to reach the Samaritans. Not one of the disciples, but the woman that society had not loved well. And Jesus engages with her in a really respectful, quite theological debate. He just shows great respect for her knowledge and questions. And he actually engages with her. This is the longest conversation recorded in the Bible between Jesus and anyone. So he has this respect for this woman and leans in and answers her questions and wants to engage in her. So I think Jesus is here in Samaria. You know, when he had to go through, I think it was a divine appointment because he knew he had to reach the Samaritans. And we don't know why he chose this woman. But what we can see is that in the course of a short conversation, she moves from worship as a concept of duty, conducted in a sacred place. You know, she goes from those questions about, is it here, is it there, where am I supposed to do the thing, to a deep personal understanding of what it really is to worship. And I think that's the thing that Jesus sees in her. He's not looking at our credentials. He's not looking at what our CV says we're capable of. He doesn't even look at how the world has treated us or what the world might say about us. He wants to know, what sort of a worshipper are you? Where's your heart? And when we think about, you know, what sort of a worshipper we are, I do just want to reiterate that at no point did all of her questioning, and she's quite challenging of Jesus. You know, she's not kind of a, well, what about? She's like, no, hang on, you haven't even got a bucket. She's quite challenging. That is not a problem for Jesus. Jesus sees the direction of her travel. He sees that she's leaning in. So it's not about having the answers. It's not about having worked it out. As long as your worship is pointed towards God, that's enough. God will use you for his purposes. You know, I think this woman has made many mistakes and been hurt many times, I am sure. And yet she is the model that Jesus puts forward and says, see this woman who comes to the well at midday alone. She is worthy of my time, my respect, and my love. And she didn't get it right the first time. You know, it took her a while for the penny to drop. You know, she got there eventually, but it took her a little while. But she kept pursuing. She kept leaning in, and she won the prize. Now, I think so often we think about it's about the destination. It's about when we've got the thing, or when we've found the right person, or when I've got that ministry position, or when I'm doing the whatever. And Jesus says, no. It's about who are you pursuing? What's the direction of your heart? And he's also very clear, we will only be satisfied when the direction of our heart is Jesus. That's the only answer. And when this woman realized that that's who she was talking to and that was the direction of her heart, her life was radically changed. She went straight back into the village. She shared her story. Many Samaritans came to God. And she was the catalyst that Jesus used for that. And so as we think about, you know, what it is to have a heart of worship, you know, when I say I worship Jesus, I don't want that to mean I sing sometimes, or that I perform some jobs in church, or that I come to church on Sunday. I want that to mean that my spirit is in a dogged pursuit of Jesus. I want to be that person continually leaning in. And when I meet Jesus face to face, I want to be like that. I want to be like that when I meet Jesus. And that means I've got to come from here. I've got to be leaning in. I've got to be pursuing him so that when I come face to face, I can kiss his hand. That's the sort of worshiper I want to be. In spirit and in truth. I want to wrap up there. But if that's the sort of worshiper you would like to be, if you're struggling at some point in that journey, if you've got stuck somewhere, you can't quite get to that relationship, please come forward. Like we've all been there. It's about a journey. It's not saying we have to be at the end. It's about a journey. And I'd love to pray for you. If you want some prayer to break through some barriers to get on that journey and to restore that relationship with God wherever you might be. Because we know that that's, Jesus says, he is the only answer to that satisfaction, to that hole that we're looking for. And if this story of this woman has raised up any issues for you, I'd love you to come up for some prayer as well, because the world can make judgments of us and say things about us. And I want to assure you that's not how Jesus sees you. He sees the heart. So if you'd like to come up for that as well, you'd be very welcome to. And of course, if you'd like to come up for prayer for anything at all, I'd be very happy to pray. Love to pray with the people of God. So open up the altar. We've got coffee, tea, biscuits downstairs in the hub, and great fellowship. Always great fellowship down in the hub. So please feel free. Services come to a close. But if you would like to come up for prayer, please, altars open.